seats as well. We are going to commence the semi-final. Welcome to the semi-finals of the main break at the 29th World University Debating Championships held by University College Cork. Welcome to the motion for the House today is that this House believes that government should subsidise private home ownership. In the first proposition, we have Wellington A with Holly Hickey and Stephen Whittington. First opposition, we have Harvard A with Lewis Bollard and Cormac Early. In the second proposition, we have Oxford C with Alex Warsnip and Jonathan Leader Maynard. And in second opposition, we have Queensland A with Evan Goldman and Lauren Humphrey. Just before we start, I've been asked to tell you the ESL final will be immediately after this round. The judges will go off and do their judgment while that final takes place, and we will try to tell you the results at the end of the ESL final. So go straight from here to whichever, well, the ESL final, which they'll tell you where it is. In the same place the break announcement was. Let's go. I'd like to call from Wellington A, Holly Higby to propose a case for stamps in her name.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the 1970s, it cost 10% of the average wage to meet the mortgage repayments required for the average family house in the United States. Today, that percentage is 40%, and it is increasingly hard for people buying their first home to be able to meet those requirements. And we think there are significant benefits to owning your first home, which is why we would have the government help these people out. We think that the government has acted in some areas which has made it harder for these individuals to buy homes, which is why they need to act in other areas to try and balance out those benefits. I'm going to be doing three things for you today in my speech. First of all, I'm going to be talking about the model that we propose. Second of all, I'm going to be looking at the causes of why people are finding it difficult to buy their first home, and why we think this is going to help those causes. And last, I'm going to be looking at a number of the benefits. My Deputy Prime Minister is going to be looking at why these benefits will also flow on to employers in the areas where these people will be living. So ladies and gentlemen, what do we propose? We proposed a shared equity scheme between the government and between the people who are purchasing their houses. And this will be, for example, for an individual who's buying their first-time house, but if it is a couple who is buying their first-time house, that will be counted as the first-time house buying for both of them. What we would propose, ladies and gentlemen, what we in fact do propose, is that the government will purchase up to 50% of the house that you wish to buy. The individual or the couple will front up with the other 50%, and you will pay back the government that 50% over a long period of time at very low interest rates, ladies and gentlemen. We also think that you should be able to purchase perhaps houses provided by the state or the government that you may be living in, as you see in many countries in the West at the moment, where the government will provide houses that people are currently renting. They could buy those, but of course the state should also expand any of the housing stock that they need to make up for the fact that there are people buying those houses. So why do we think that we've come to this situation, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you, sir. We'd say that first buyers have been excluded from the housing market for two reasons. The first one of those reasons is that people are living longer and people are earning for longer, ladies and gentlemen, which means that they are retiring later. When you're earning a lot of wealth, ladies and gentlemen, then you have a lot more to spend on buying, for example, other houses in residential housing markets, which you can then use as capital to go on and to make more investments, or in fact, just for pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, because lots of people do like to have lots of houses. We say that as the upper echelons in terms of age of society are buying more houses, no thank you, and are earning more than the lower, that in that situation, that means that there are fewer houses for those who are younger and who perhaps don't have as much wealth to get. Back in the 70s, ladies and gentlemen, where people were not earning as much later into their years, it was harder for them to purchase a number of houses. But second of all, we'd say that there are things, no thank you, such as zoning restrictions, which means that the government has said that there are certain areas that you're only allowed to use for commercial purposes, which means that there are fewer areas and thus fewer houses to buy for residential purposes. Moreover, we'd say that there's been stricter building codes, ladies and gentlemen, which means that for these people in terms of purchasing their first house, that the actual price has gone up. So there's a number of factors, and a number of them seem to be, no thank you, government related. And although we can see benefits from those factors, like perhaps maybe we do want to have commercial zones or residential zones, on the flip side of that coin, it is harder for young individuals and young couples often starting out with families to actually go and purchase a house. And we think that if all of a sudden the government is going to be lending to you at a very, very low rate and you're not going to have to pay that back for a very long time, that it is going to make it a lot easier for you to buy that house. And I'll accept you, ma'am.
That definition sounds a lot like a subprime loan, a very low rate, and you don't have to pay it back for a long time. Why would the government do what has obviously been a disaster?
Well, the problem with the subprime crisis, ladies and gentlemen, is that what you've seen is an absolute absence of stability in terms of what you borrow and what kind of return that you're going to get. We think that the government can provide a lot more stability in saying that we're the government and we're going to be here and this is our policy for a very long time, ladies and gentlemen, and that you do have a long time to be able to pay it back. We think that that is a lot more stable than the sort of situation that you're seeing in the banks, ladies and gentlemen. So what are the particular benefits that we do see from actually being able to get a house and be able to buy your first house? And the first thing is that we think that as soon as you have capital, ladies and gentlemen, that provides opportunities and benefits to you in being able to borrow against your house and to use that capital for things such as starting a business. And we think that it's incredibly beneficial for young people who often find it very difficult to be able to raise huge amounts of wealth to do something like start a business, which in itself is wealth creation, ladies and gentlemen. We think that if the government is going to help you to do that and to give you that capital to borrow against, that provides more opportunities for those people, where at the moment a lot of those opportunities are trapped with people who are often older and have huge amounts of wealth in the housing market, who often own a number of different things against which they can borrow. But furthermore, we say that there are some positive externalities in terms of being in one house, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of owning that house and knowing that you and perhaps your family is going to stay there for a very long time, that perhaps aren't automatically reflected back and gained back to the individual who buys that house, or perhaps to some of the people who also get those positive externalities. So for example, we think that things such as school boards, which you see in a lot of the countries that we're talking about, that a positive benefit coming to them when they have families which will stay in the same area and will be willing to put back to that. But ladies and gentlemen, it's very unlikely that a school board is going to front up with the cost of your house. So there are a number of benefits that are going to people, ladies and gentlemen, that we can see coming from this policy. So why is it that you create stronger communities when you actually have people staying in these houses, ladies and gentlemen, and owning their house? If you look at the way that, for example, houses that are rented are treated as opposed to houses which people own, you see that a lot more care is given to those houses. Also, those people who are in that community know that they're going to be there for a long time and want to build up that community and invest in that community. So, for example, they will join the school board, they will coach the soccer club, perhaps they'll stand for local council, ladies and gentlemen. All things which contribute to making these communities a better place. And when those people know that they are going to be there for a long time and are rooted within that community, then that is an important benefit that we see flowing from it. But furthermore, we say that in the long run, it will lessen social security costs, because people who have houses and have capital can borrow against them, ladies and gentlemen, can take out a mortgage and can use that to fund their living costs. In the long run, it is a wealth-creating policy, and in the long run, we believe there are significant benefits of For those reasons, we are most proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Now, let's call on Leader of the Opposition, Lewis Pollard, to take place on.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Side government apparently has a problem that not enough parents are going out and playing soccer with their kids. And so they found the one dependent variable that they think determines that, which is apparently whether you own a home. We don't think it is. We think that there are lots of reasons that affect whether people integrate into their communities, and we don't think that the government should do something based on a concept of fairness that dates back to houses being cheaper in the 1960s. But that said, I have three major questions. The first question is, why are we incentivising home ownership at all for individuals? Secondly, why is the state subsidising this? And thirdly, this idea of fairness, and is this really such a great idea? What we tell you first of all is that we see under this basic idea of incentivising home ownership that we don't think it's always logical to buy a home. Indeed, we think right now that if anything, the market over-incentivises buying a home. There are countries which don't charge capital gains tax, so essentially you gain something implicitly financially from owning a home versus long-term renting. We tell you furthermore that people have a natural psychological disposition, like in government today, towards thinking that homes are necessarily better than renting when they might not be. What we tell you furthermore though, is we think that the subprime crisis stands as a very clear indication of this. And this is especially dangerous, because what they set up on side government today is essentially the subprime crisis ×2. Because we think not only are they buying into the whole rationale that fueled the subprime crisis, we think they're actually taking it a step further. And you saw this in the response from Polly to a point of information, where she said, oh well, the government's got a long-term interest, so it won't be a problem this time. We say a lot of the problem with the subprime crisis was not about people borrowing, was not about people lending out money, but about the people borrowing money. Now, why is it worse under their model? Well, it's worse, first of all, because they didn't tell you anything about credit checks in their model today. We think that at the point, essentially, that these people already aren't receiving credit from private lenders, there might be a reason why they're not. And we think that at that point, what they're basically saying is we'll give free credit to credit-unworthy people. We don't think that's something which is great for the state to be doing, either for those people themselves or for the state's balance book. No, thank you. We tell you, secondly, that is especially dangerous because they're giving you lower interest rates than commercial lenders would. We say this creates the perception of free capital, that essentially you can get as much money from the state you want and it won't cost anything. We think that's problematic when these people were already taking out too much money on these houses, you get them to take out even more. We tell you a few more things on this point of why we don't think you should be incentivising home ownership. We think there are three big disadvantages to this asset class as opposed to other things they could be investing in with that money. We think the first and most obvious one is that housing is not as liquid as other forms of assets. We say you can sell your shares overnight when you lost your job, you can't necessarily sell your house. We tell you secondly, we think this is a far more volatile asset class. We saw entire streets be shut down, but the houses go to half their value overnight. We don't think that happens if you put your money in the bank. What we tell you thirdly is we think this is a far bigger portion of people's assets. We don't think that people spend 10 years worth of their salaries on buying some shares in one company. We do think they spend it on housing. We think you create essentially a far bigger downside for these people when things fall. Yes, sir.
Given that credit checks deny you credit based on the postcode in which you live in and whether there are poor people nearby, don't you think maybe they're inequitable?
So if you think there are problems with the current credit check system, we think that the way you have to deal with that is to actually sort out the underlying problem there, which is that private lenders may not be assessing risk in the right way. Now we say we don't essentially have a problem with better regulating private financial lenders. That's not problematic, and we've seen central banks step in to do that in the current crisis. What we have a problem with doing is sending the government, that has no expertise in this area of lending to private individuals, into the sphere to take on a risk that they haven't acknowledged the first government will even be a risk on the government's balance sheet. What we tell you furthermore is we don't think that we should be actually incentivising these people to get home ownership in the first place. And we tell you the final reason for that is we think that in the current crisis, what we most need people in these positions, and especially lower income people, which is what this debate is primarily about, we most need them ready to do, is to be able to move. Because what we tell you is that with globalisation, jobs are moving position. We think that a lot of the current crisis is not just temporary, but structural. And at the point that Detroit is going to shut down, we don't think it's useful to be incentivising people to buy new houses or to keep houses in Detroit. We think at the point that we want people to be able to move to different jobs in different parts of the country, it's actually better that we incentivise renting. Because the biggest opportunity cost in going to take up a new job somewhere is that you just bought a house that you can't find an owner.
Okay.
We think that as long as the state has an interest in that, we think it's really important that they don't incentivise this idea of home ownership. Secondly, we tell you there's a problem with state subsidies here. Because what we haven't seen is a compelling case from this side of the house today that this is a public good. What we tell you is that private goods are not paid for by the state. We don't see them putting in incentives for owning beds or owning televisions. What we do tell you is that the state can sometimes incentivise public goods. Look at healthcare, look at subsidising clean power. They do so when there are positive externalities, not shown at first speaker. They do so when there is a reduced cost to the state, also not shown at first speaker. What we tell you essentially is that we think that there are very real harms, however, to creating a situation where the state just enters and begins subsidising private goods because there's a popular will to do so. We think that's fundamentally problematic. We tell you furthermore, at the point that the state is buying into this, we see huge potential social harms. Because they didn't talk about the sort of hole this is going to create within the state's balance sheet, but we think it's a very serious one. We think all you're doing is transferring this financial risk across to the state and putting it in a position where whenever it goes into a downturn, it has to borrow even more and cut social spending even more to compensate for that. We think that comes back and becomes incredibly counterproductive. Finally, I want to close on this idea of what's actually fair. Because what we see essentially is, first of all, this notion of the sort of social benefit that this is going to get people to reinvest in their communities. And we don't think that's going to happen for a couple of reasons. We think the first, most basic level is that people reinvest in their community more to do with things like whether they like their kids, like whether they like standing on the sideline of a soccer game. We think that people can invest and can go into long-term renting, and they haven't shown us why long-term renting is any different on this side of the house in terms of people's willingness to stay invested in their community. But we tell you secondly on this kind of idea that because the cost of housing has gone up, and because this had something to do with the state putting in commercial and residential zoning, we don't think that creates a moral case for action. What we tell you is that there were lots of things that were different in the 1960s, and the state's done lots of things to make life better today. For example, reducing the relative cost of food, reducing the relative cost of driving, increasing people's wages so they can afford to pay for this housing. What we think is most important is the cost of living that the state's put into place. And the question beyond that comes, if poverty does still exist, what is the most efficient means to address it? We haven't seen anything on the side of the house today to suggest that this is the most efficient means to address poverty. We're still waiting to hear that. On these grounds, we are proud to oppose.
While Lewis thought he could pretend that we'd never talked about the massive positive externalities that would come about because of our policy and never engage with the analysis that said that we would create strong communities, he also thought it was okay to just scaremonger by throwing out the word credit crunch and subprime mortgage crisis as if that gave some kind of analysis as to why we should not pursue the policy that has been proposed at opening government. The first thing I'm going to do is establish why, in fact, this is so very different to the policies pursued that have led to the subprime crisis, and why that suggests that the only way to deal with the problem is through the policy we've proposed. The second thing is I want to move on to the positive externalities set out by Polly at first speaker and go back over them and demonstrate why those have never been engaged with. And then I want to move on to my substantive about the effects that this will have on business and local communities. So let's start with this issue of why this will not lead to a greater or bigger subprime crisis. And we think that there are three differences between the kinds of policies previously pursued by governments and the ones suggested by opening government. The first is that the subprime crisis occurred because government forced private banks to lend to people when they knew they couldn't get the money back. Right? That's what the Community Reinvestment Act did in 1995 when it was strengthened. It forced the onus on private banks to do that. The important difference between private and public is private needs to run at a profit and public does not. So when you put the onus on private banks to do something and run something at a loss, of course that impacts on their bottom line, and of course that is potentially going to lead to bank collapses when people can't pay back their loans. On the other hand, when you have something in the public sphere, they often run at a loss. Social Security runs at a loss. Welfare runs at a loss. But the effect of and the capacity that government has is they can require some people, the people who already own houses and are fairly wealthy, to pay for the benefits that providing that to low-income people has. The second distinction is that there was no stability in the kind of governmental policies pursued, right? The federal funds rate wasn't set at 1% for 20 years, it was set at 1% for 3 years and encouraged people to take out a lot of loans. And then when the federal funds rate went up to 6%, they suddenly found that they couldn't actually pay the kind of loans that they'd taken out. We're not suggesting we implement this policy and change it every 5 years, we're suggesting we implement it and don't change it. So the difference in the degree of stability means that the subprime issue is not a factor. The third way in which it's different is that the way in which the subprime crisis was caused was by a lot more blunt of a policy. They said, we're going to subsidise home ownership generally through the setting up of government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. There was no way in which they tried to direct their benefits towards low-income people who had not yet purchased a house, first home buyers. And that's why the difference in degree is significant, because it's less likely to lead to market-wide catastrophe because we're only focusing on a limited part of the market rather than a general policy. Okay, on this issue of credit checks, obviously there are problems with credit checks, as was pointed out by closing government, but we say the fact that they're required to source 50% of the equity themselves means that there is a way in which we are checking the ability of these people to repay their loans, right? Nobody buys a house with a 50% deposit, and that therefore they're getting some of the money from a private bank. That's the aspect that provides the sufficient credit check. Let's move on to this issue of positive externalities, because Lewis said, unless you can identify as positive externalities, we don't think you should pursue this policy. Well, that's very interesting, because we actually identified 3 positive externalities in the case that we sent out today. The first one is that we said it would lead to greater community engagement. And you can get up here and make a joke about soccer mums, but you never actually engaged with our analysis that said it's more in the interests of homeowners to get involved in local community groups like school boards, because the benefits to them are greater. Think about it logically. If you move every year and you move the school that your kid attends every year, the benefit that you get from being on the school board is relatively limited, because they're only there for that short while. Whereas if you can establish a good school framework through which they will go for very many years, there's a lot of a greater benefit for them. I'll take the closing.
Do you realise that one of the only reasons why the rental market has become more itinerant in recent years is because so many people are occupying homes that once would have been investment properties, that they have to change homes all the time because they can't get a home to rent in their own suburbs?
No, the reason why they have to change homes all the time is because the control over the destiny of the place where they live is no longer in their control. Lewis said, what about long-term renting? Well, that's not good enough if the landlord says, actually guys, your rent's going up because house prices are going up, you've got to move into a lower socio-economic area. That's the important point. They don't control the actual place where they live in the same way as when they own their own home. So we pointed you firstly to the positive externality provided to other people in the community through encouraging people to get involved in communities. The second thing that we told you is that it would lead to increased entrepreneurship. People who are discriminated against because they come from low socioeconomic areas and are young and have been excluded from the property market for the reasons that we gave will more likely be able to borrow against their home to actually undertake commercial enterprise in the first place. We say that that's significant benefit for the local community. Let's move now to the effects on businesses and employers, because Lewis told us that people needed to be moved around to actually get jobs and things like that. Obviously, right, there's a balance here between people moving around and people staying in one place and the business being safer and employing somebody because they don't need to find somebody new in 6 months. So we've pointed you to 2 particular benefits of people living in the same place. From the perspective of the business, the first benefit is lower compliance costs. When you take on a new employee, there's a whole lot of government regulation that you have to jump through, which means that you're less likely to take on people that aren't secure in their place of abode. What that means is you discriminate against low socioeconomic and young people in favour of people who own their own home. We say, let's sort out that inequity by allowing people to establish a permanent place of abode and therefore receive employment from employers. The second thing is obviously if you're taking on a lot of new workers because, hey, the other guy had to move out because the landlord put up his rent, is you have to undertake a whole lot more training. So in fact, by ensuring that people have a permanent place of abode, you lessen the discrimination against young people and people of low socioeconomic status who are less likely to be stable workers from the point of view of the business because they are required to move. By enabling them to establish a permanent place of abode, you ensure that in fact employers will employ them because they're less worried about the likelihood of them leaving. This is not the subprime issue mortgage. They've obviously walked into a different debate than the one they expected, ladies and gentlemen. We definitely need to do this because of the massive externality benefits that it has on communities, businesses and individuals, so we propose.
Deputy Prime Minister. Now from Vermont A,
Mr. Speaker, subprime, subprime, subprime. And with that level of analysis, I've just beaten everything they've told you, but that's okay, because I'm going to go on and actually look at this effect that this will have on the markets. Because what we tell you is that they fundamentally misunderstood what's going on with subprime. It wasn't just about private banks, it was about the whole system of housing finance in general, and they've got that wrong. Then I want to move on and look at this idea of positive externalities when we subsidize things and what we're actually subsidizing in this case, because we think they've got that. So this effect on markets and subprime in general. First of all, what we tell you is that lower income and young people, as a group, have lower job stability, lower income, obviously, because they're low-income people, and also are less recession-proof than other groups of people, right? But the problem is that we can't tell on an individual level who's going to be recession-proof and who's not. So we know that by subsidizing this group, we're going to shove this group into an asset class that's not necessarily favorable for them, some of whom will then default when a downturn happens, but we don't know who that is. So it's impossible to regulate against shoving those particularly risky people into this aspect of the market, and we think that's very, very bad. No, thank you. So what we tell you is that you can't prevent the misallocation of this subsidy. So what you're going to do is wholesale move people into a very large illiquid asset class, no thank you, which isn't necessarily going to be favorable for them. And what we tell you then is that in any kind of a downturn, you know that you're going to have a certain level of defaults which would be higher than the open market would provide by itself. Why is that a problem, Mr. Speaker? It's a problem for several reasons. First of all, we tell you that housing is a uniquely volatile asset class, one that's uniquely vulnerable to contagion, because it is something that's seen not just in purely investor terms, but no thank you, as Lewis told you, something that's seen as psychologically very important, and something that people give a lot of emotional weight to. So the reason that that's more volatile is that essentially if one house on a street forecloses, that drags down the value of the entire street, because it seems like a risky street to buy on. More generally, if a certain number of houses foreclose, the entire housing market goes down. That's incredibly bad, no thank you. So if there's a downturn for any reason at all, what this will do is multiply it. Moreover, it's going to multiply it even more because housing is such a huge portion of equity, not just for poor people, but even for middle class people. And at the point where you're removing all the equity from these people, they're going to spend less. They're going to use less money, there'll be fewer jobs, so that's going to reinforce the effect on poor people and drag even more of them out of the ability to pay these loans to the government. So what this is going to do is create a self-reinforcing cycle of poverty and of downturn. That's how the subprime crisis happened, not just because private banks were involved, not the government. It was that people who couldn't necessarily afford to pay in a downturn could afford to pay when things were looking good. And that's what they're creating on their side of the house as well, and that, Mr. Speaker, is subprime. So what we tell you is this won't necessarily drag down private banks on their side of the house, but what it is going to do is drag down the government, which we think is worse. The reason the government will be able to provide this extra stability, no thank you, is that the government can take on massive amounts of debt. But when the government does that, no thank you, even governments have to pay eventually. So what this means is cuts in social services, cuts in the kind of programs that will get these people back into employment, no thank you, and get them able to pay for their houses again. So we think that's really quite bad. More importantly, no thank you. We think things like the Community Reinvestment Act that they told us about in their side of the house didn't exist in countries like Britain and Ireland, and we still had subprime crises, we still have housing bubbles, and markets in, no thank you, a really bad place right now. So we don't think it was all about the government making the private banks do stupid things, it was also about the government incentivizing stupid things, like on their side of the house.
Sir, we know that you may end up here underwriting poor people. Why do you think subsidising or helping poor people is only justified when it's profit-making?
Because when you do it in a stupid way that will fundamentally distort the market, it's going to lead to more poverty eventually, and it will make that poverty worse. That's why. This is bad for poor people as well. So we were told that the government will be okay because you'll be getting 50% from the banks. A couple of problems with this, Mr. Speaker. One, it's much easier to get 50% than 100% from the banks, especially when you've got a government guarantee on the other 50%. So you are still incentivizing bad private lending on your side of the house. Moreover, though, with this 50%, the banks are at risk again, just like subprime. So essentially, they haven't in any way solved the problems that led to the subprime crisis. So let's look now at the benefits that they claim to be giving us, these positive externalities, because we accept on both sides of the house that we should only subsidize something where there's a seriously large social good that the private market won't provide. So what goods have they brought us? They've told us that people will engage in their communities because they own houses and know they won't move. Mr. Speaker, we don't buy the sociology of that point. We just don't believe that people engage with their communities purely because they know they've got a house. We think people engage in things like parent-teacher associations and things like kids' soccer clubs, no thank you, because it's good for their children and people like their children and doing good things for them. We think that's enough of an incentive on our side of the house, no thank you, to provide these goods to communities even if people don't know that they're necessarily going to be there for the next 5 or 10 years. We think maybe you'll get some marginal incentive on their side of the house to do this, but they've given you absolutely no weighing of costs and benefits in terms of the size of this marginal incentive. No thank you, when we say there's plenty of incentive anyway. No thank you, the next thing they tell you is that this will promote entrepreneurship and end discrimination against young people and poor people and whatever. We tell you there are a number of problems with this. First of all, entrepreneurship isn't generally promoted, no thank you, by making lots of people put their capital into homes, which are not generally an asset class that creates more entrepreneurship. We think that's one problem. Then they told us it's okay, we'll solve this because they'll borrow against the values of their homes. That's what led to the crisis now, Mr. Speaker. That's not a good idea. It hasn't worked. It's not going to work. Then we were told, well, this is equitable because poor people, just society doesn't like them. They just do very well. Poor people can't get homes. They can't get jobs. All sorts of things are bad for poor people. This may very well be the case, but what we tell you is that the government has many nice programs that help poor people, and one of the things that's really useful for these programs is for the government not to be essentially bankrupt, which is what's going to happen as soon as there's a downturn on their side of the house. In the long term, we're helping poor people more than they are. Finally, what you're incentivizing as a negative externality is reducing the mobility of people who need mobility most. Because if you're poor, if you can't find a job in Detroit or wherever, move somewhere else because that's where you're most likely to find a job. That's where you're most likely to find your place in the market and to be able to extract the maximum value from your labor and from your skills. What they're doing is disincentivizing this and making people stay in communities where it's not necessarily a good idea for them to be, all at the expense of the stability of the financial system. For all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Now, second proposition, constancy is tied to run.
Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition have forgotten one fundamental thing about welfare states and advanced industrial democracies, and that's that we already provide public housing. Ladies and gentlemen, from proposition extension, what we're going to tell you is that the market is already distorted. We say that this provides better efficiency by creating a tier between public housing and the private market unassisted. We're going to talk about two things today. Firstly, private versus public housing, how this takes more people out of public housing, both directly and indirectly, why that's a good thing, why getting them into private housing is a good thing. Secondly, we're going to talk about the issue which has already been touched on in the debate about ownership versus rental and show you why ownership is better. Before I do either of those two things, I want to do some rebuttal. And almost everything was about the subprime crisis, so I suppose I'm going to have to talk about it. Ladies and gentlemen, we say that in the subprime crisis, one of the big problems was that mortgages were sold packaged together with different levels of risk. They were then sold fraudulently under a banner that they were good loans when they were not. We say the government is not doing this under this model. We say that the government will not make this kind of bad investments. No thanks. Furthermore, we say that when they stand up and say, well, this gives credit to people who don't deserve credit, we say, well, what do you mean by deserve credit? We say that private credit agencies rank you not based on any considerations of equity. Ladies and gentlemen, we think it's a problem that you can't get credit based on your postcode. We think it's a problem that in the current circumstances where you can be denied credit in the current financial crisis for all sorts of reasons. It's a problem that you can be denied credit because your mother or father defaulted on their credit payments. It's a problem that you can be denied credit because you've never been able to take out a credit card and you're 35 and you haven't built up any credit. We think all these things are huge barriers to social mobility that stop poorer people who can't get credit in the first place from ever moving up the ladder. We think that's a huge problem. It's not good enough, no thanks, for them to say, well, if we've got a problem with the credit check system, like fix that, because we're not going to force we're not going to force private lenders to give loans to these people. That really would be stupid. That really would be like the subprime crisis. And I don't think it's something you guys are going to want to defend. We think it's the government that should be doing this. We say that if the government ends up underwriting these people, fine. It's a good trade-off. It has massive benefits. We say the government already provides huge subsidies in the forms of public housing. If it can do it this way instead, it actually makes smaller outlays that are more efficient, and that's what we're going to talk about in our extension. The next thing that we hear is that, like, generally people are going to end up not being able to afford stuff. No thanks, under our model. We say this is the wrong comparison. You shouldn't be comparing private people with debt under our model with people renting private housing without debt under some perfect pie-in-the-sky model. The relevant comparison is people renting privately versus, is private ownership versus rental. We say those are rental payments that people often can't keep up with. And here's the major problem. They're making this outlay all their life, ladies and gentlemen. Because we say, if you can never afford to buy a house privately, you actually end up spending often much more than the cost of the house on rental throughout your whole life, because you can never afford to make that initial outlay. But that means, no thanks, that perversely, poorer people are paying more for their housing than richer people, because it's not an initial outlay that they have to make. That's a huge problem, and that stops them from spending, and that stops them from being able to speculate and take risks and all sorts of stuff that I'm going to talk about in my second extension point. Finally, they say this is a distortion of the market. I'll take in just a second this. Finally, they say this is a distortion of the market. We say that the public housing already distorts the market. Lewis.
Sir, if fairness is your aim, why are you only offering this policy to those poor people who can already afford the first 50%?
Okay. Here's the thing. Okay, we say there are spillover benefits, because when you take the people that can almost afford private housing but can't quite without a subsidy out of the public system and out of the rental system, that makes it better for the really poor people in the public system and eases overcrowding levels. What I'm going to talk about in my first point now. We say there are three tiers: private ownership, private rental, and public rental. We say, firstly, this directly transfers people from public rental to private ownership when people buy houses that were previously owned by the state and so forth. We see this happening when houses get sold off. We think that's very beneficial. You also see it happening indirectly, because under our policy, more people move from private rental to public ownership, and that eases pressure on the private rental market and drives private rents down, which means that more people can afford to move from public housing to that private rental as well. We say, so overall, this moves people from public towards private housing. That has two benefits. Firstly, it means that we need a less monolithic public housing system. We say public housing systems in welfare states are generally absolute disasters. They're ridden with crime, they're completely overcrowded. All research suggests that the literal size of these places affects the extent to which there is deprivation and crime and vandalism and so forth. We say easing pressure and overcrowding is a very beneficial thing to do here. And we say, seeing as the state already gives this housing to people free, Op can't paint it as an infraction for us to stop giving them houses free or an extremely low rental and simply subsidise. The second benefit we see from moving from public towards private is that we can have a more equitable public housing system. In a lot of systems in advanced welfare states, what we have is people getting public housing based on how long they've been waiting, not their actual need. And we say this actually selects for the people, by taking out the people that are like slightly higher up but at the moment can't afford private accommodation. It selects for those people, takes them out and leaves us with people who are really needy in the public housing system. So we say, really, this is a model that improves greater efficiency, because we say there's a huge market failure at the moment, no thanks, and there's an incentive to stay in the public housing system, and this corrects that. Let's finally talk about the issue which has already been touched on, about ownership versus rental. We say having a private home is a basis for stable expectations, such that you aren't living hand-to-mouth day to day. We say that this means that you can take career paths that require less immediate income, but more expected income in the future. For example, you can become a bus driver. That's a decent income, but it will never increase through your whole life. Alternatively, you can become an office worker. That starts on a lower income than a bus driver, but has opportunities for promotion. If you're trying to pay rent, you have to take the bus driver job to afford it. If you've got a basis for stable expectations, you can take the office worker job, and that allows you to have social mobility and move up the ladder. Finally, in terms of communities, First Rock already touched on this. They said, well, it's fluffy, people already love their kids. No, the point is this, people love their kids either way, but people love their neighbours' kids only if they want to increase the value of their house price. People love the community only if they want to increase the value of their house for when they want to sell it off. And that's the incentive to provide for the community as a whole. That's the reason to stand on the proposition.
Opposition for Queensland A, I'd like to invite Evan Goldman.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the biggest problem with the proposition today is they seem to think that renters and homeowners are just separate breeds of people, when in reality, they're the same people. Some people are paying much less for their entire lives per week, per fortnight or per month to occupy housing and have a roof over their heads. And other people, regardless of the interest on the loan, are going to have a massive debt for the rest of their lives, longer than any of the home loans that we have under the status quo right now, and they're going to be paying more for the rest of their lives. These people do not treat their children differently or their neighbours' children differently, and the causal link behind this seems to be that they thought all renters are nomadic. They just move around constantly from job to job, from house to house. The only reason why there are current problems with the rental market, particularly in the United States, is because the price of housing is going up so much because too many people are entering the market. They are perpetuating that problem, they are making it manifestly worse, and they are going to make it much, much worse for low-income people, people that really should be renting, and if anything, no thank you, we should be helping to rent. What we on the closing opposition will give you is the missing economic analysis from this debate. We will be showing you how this will drive up housing prices, how it will choke the rental market. And the reason why that's so important is they seem to be treating all renters as the same people. And that's homogenous, so they are different from home buyers. The point here is we have to look at who's actually going to take them up on this offer. There are finite numbers of houses, and they're giving this to everyone. Across society, more people who just couldn't afford a house might be taking it up, but the people in their housing estates are still not going to be buying these homes. No, thank you. And the price of their rent is going to go up massively. And for everybody else who happens to be in the rental market. So, let's look at the first issue here. That is why the government should not propagate the myth, no thank you, of universal home ownership. That is part of the problem with Western society right now. What we have is, no thank you, the American dream. In Australia we call it the Australian dream. The only difference is the Hills voice, but you know. In New Zealand they call it the Australian dream as well. Because we're not sure about the British dream because we only get American television these days. But the point here is, that myth is what is a problem with our society right now. That people think that they have a right to home ownership rather than just a right to a roof over their heads, rather than a right to occupy a house. There is no right to home ownership. It is not something the government should be providing. No, thank you. And the real problem is the practical way in which that manifests itself in a debt-ridden society. No, thank you. We're already talking about people who are already in far too much credit card debt.
Sir.
We're already talking about a societal-wide addiction to debt. And all this does is create another debt. And it works, it's insidious, it's a perennial debt. The whole point of it being such low interest is you will have this debt for the rest of your lives. No, thank you. They seem to think that that will give you capital to buy a business. The people that really needed this are not going to have that capital to buy businesses anyway, because they just won't be worth enough, even with the government subsidy. But what do they have? The same thing that people, no thank you, with really high student loans have right now, but manifestly much larger. That is a debt that stops you from borrowing more, that stops you from getting the same credit rating with banks in the first place. They're not going to be able to operate wider, they're going to operate a whole lot smaller. So what is the other problem here? And that is that as a society, we should be encouraging saving rather than debt, and that's exactly what this no thank you interferes with. People should save in order to buy their home, and especially in order to buy the deposit for their home. No, thank you. What this does is the government just provides half of the cost of your home as far as the banks are concerned. So that means there will be no saving amongst the people involved. Why is this? Exactly like the subprime mortgage crisis once again. And that is, no thank you, because of the experience for owners. You need to, if you want to successfully pay back a loan, even if half of it is low interest, you need to have a style of saving. These are people who will never have saved in their lives. No, thank you. Who will never have experienced saving. You need to, if you want to successfully pay back a loan, have to be in the habit of putting aside, no thank you, large amounts of your weekly or monthly income in order to do that. And part of the problem, and I'll get to in just a second, with the subprime mortgage crisis, is people being given loans who have not done that and are not going to do that. Yes?
If you're concerned about saving, can you tell us where most people invest their savings?
Okay, well, most people invest their savings in a home, quite frankly. But the point is that they have to have savings to do so under the status quo. It is not a bad thing, by the way, when people invest in a home. It is a bad thing when the government buys your investments for you, and there is a major difference between those two things. The second issue here is this is going to do two big economic things in the market. One is to massively raise the price of housing, and the other is to choke the rental market, and they're related to each other. No, thank you. We heard from the opening proposition, who I'm going to be calling Freddie Mac in this debate from now on. Closing would be Freddie Mac. No, thank you. We heard from the opening proposition that the reason why housing prices are going up is because of like a whole host of things like zoning, etc. Absolutely untrue, or only peripherally true. The reason why housing prices are going up is because far more people are entering the market. And the reason why the average is now 40% instead of 10% is because too many people who can't really afford to pay back those loans on their income are part of that market. This perpetuates that problem. What it will do is bring more people into the market, massively more people into the market. That is going to raise the price of this housing so much that the government probably hasn't even made a positive investment here. They're going to lose the subsidy in the amount that the housing prices are going to go up. And we know this is particularly true for the housing market because we know that it's one of those institutions where you pay what you are able to get a house and people ask for the amount that people are able to pay. That's why housing bubbles operate already. So we know that we're going to lose most of this subsidy in rising housing. But what does that do more importantly for the rental market? It means that when everybody owns their own home and can get a great investment out of owning their own home because of these rising housing prices, that you're not going to get out of the rental market at all. The price of rent is going to go up enormously. And the real problem here, and what I want to bring it back to near the end of my speech here, is that they can't affect everyone. The lowest socio-economic group in our society are always going to rent, but you've just raised their rent massively while you raise housing prices at the same time. Ladies and gentlemen, the government should get out of the market of giving people assets.
Now, this is a summary for the Constitution Society and Constituency. I'd like to invite Jonathan to make
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that's my name, incidentally, and not a brand of cleaning fluid. I'm going to talk about 3 points today. First of all, I'm going to talk about, does subsidising private homes benefit society? Secondly, I'm going to talk about the economy. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about the distinction between public housing, rental housing, and privately owned housing, which was completely ignored by the opposition in response to Alex's extension. Before I get onto that, I want to briefly rebut the most ludicrous point that we just got out of the extension here, which is this point that under our system, house prices will rise. Like, they may well do. The problem with house prices rising is that people can't get into homes. Under our system, a lot more people get into homes. So the really good thing here is that our solution, the thing that creates the effect that they have a problem with, solves the problem that they're talking about. We think that's a somewhat fairly obvious thing that they should have looked at before making that point. Let's deal, however, with the main points of summary here, not a new extension. Does subsidising private homes benefit society? Well, first of all, let's talk about this idea of the government balance sheet, like sending catastrophic risk throughout society and so forth. First of all, the idea, no thank you, maybe later. The idea that government may lose money in this system, it may run us a loss. First of all, we say yes, we know it might, that's what's called a welfare system, that's what government intervention in the market often does. First of all, we think it's often worthwhile for governments to spend money or run things at a loss if it has massive benefits to people in that society. That would seem to be a good reason to do that. Secondly, we point out that lots of public sector systems run as a loss. We don't think that that's a massive problem. Then we have this idea of like subprime mortgages, ladies and gentlemen. It's scary, be careful, this might be similar, though they're not sure why. We say this is massively disanalogous, because the fundamental problem with the subprime mortgage system, which you probably should have understood if you wanted to base your entire bench on it, was the fact that different risky levels of mortgages were packaged together and then sold on to risk-taking investors. No thank you. That system was created precisely because there was no government system which sought to actually provide some sort of mechanism for people to get private housing. Under our system, that doesn't happen because at least half of the risk is taken on by government that doesn't invest it riskily. So there isn't the situation whereby your mortgage is invested by someone as part of a subprime mortgage into something which absolutely it cannot, no thank you, make its money back on, and then the mortgage collapses and you suddenly have to pay for it. We say that system arose precisely because of the lack of something like what we're proposing here today. So thank you. Then we have the idea of credit checks. Well, we say credit checks are, to a degree, are fine within the private market, but they have massive equity problems, like the fact that you can be denied credit on the basis of something which is in no way your fault. For example, like your parent income or the area in which you live. We didn't get any response to this from opposition. Any reason why, no thank you, they think a reliance on what the private market provides is equitable for people who may well be good savers, who may well be perfectly reliable people to give a home to, and yet are denied credit under the current system for things that are not their fault. That, ladies and gentlemen, is morally wrong, and we think governments have a duty to stop it. We then have the issue about housing and communities. This was never really dealt with by opposition. We made what we think is the fairly clear point of the idea, no thank you, that now that people have homes that they may eventually sell on, they have a financial incentive to improve those homes and keep them in a good condition, massively untrue in the public housing sector, ladies and gentlemen, which is why public housing is such a terrible state. And now they have an incentive to improve that and to be involved in their local community. They're going to stay there longer, and an incentive to improve that community, to improve their home. The only response that we got from this is, but there are lots of other reasons why people might help their home or help their community. We know that is true. We think boosting massively one of those incentives would be a good idea. We also said that a lot of those incentives only apply to your own home and not to improving your wider community, to taking an interest, for example, to the quality of your street, for example. We think this provides an additional incentive to do that. We think that's a good thing. Then, no thank you, we have the idea of this myth of the right to home ownership that should never be spread throughout society, ladies and gentlemen. Two problems with this. One, we never claimed such a right for all on our side. We said it's enormously beneficial, not that every person has like a UN-declared human right to defend it. No thank you. Secondly, no thanks, it massively contradicted their claim that we had a huge problem on our side because we were only helping some poor people and not all poor people. You can't run both those arguments. They're in contradiction. Go ahead.
Sir, given that the state is already backing up half of the loan, doesn't that provide a greater incentive for subprime lenders to take on riskier prospects?
No, we say on the contrary. Under the current system, everyone has to use subprime because there's no alternative for them to use a system which at least has half of the risk curtailed by government because it doesn't invest it riskily. Under the current system, all of it is invested riskily, so there is a 100% possibility that your thing might be invested riskily and you might lose your home. That's obvious. No thanks. No thanks. So we say, secondly, on the issue of the economy of society, a few things here. First of all, this idea that people need to move around the economy, ladies and gentlemen. Like, first of all, this helps that because now first-time buyers can do so in a way they couldn't beforehand. Secondly, it helps so because those people who don't want to move around the economy, who want to settle down, can now move into private ownership. That frees up the rental market that they cared about for the people, no thanks, that do need to move around the economy, ladies and gentlemen, so it solves their own problem better than they can. Secondly, the idea that you massively distort the economy. We say, first of all, that ignore the fact that government already intervenes in the housing market in a massive but extremely inefficient way. We think more efficiency is good. Then they said the idea people borrow and spend riskily. We see no particular reason, as we've already mentioned, why the people who are being denied houses at the moment are necessarily those who are going to spend their money most riskily. In many cases, they're being excluded for inequitable reasons. We also say that this is a basic point. No thanks. I'm going to make a basic point. We say they also live in a farcical world in which, like, nothing changes after the credit crunch. Like, no new information is gathered, no behaviour changes, nothing is learned. Banks continue to expose themselves to, like, massive losses and collapse. Like, whenever you have a financial crisis, they're nasty, but things are learned. Like from the Asian financial crisis, for example, or the Wall Street crash, systems change. We think, to some degree, a lot of these problems will be offset. We also say the economy is massively benefited because the perennial debt that they talk about already exists in the form of rental payments. Alex gave you the example of the bus driver situation. We say now people have massively more social mobility. That's good for them. We think it's moral for them. And we also think it helps the economy. Finally, more of Alex's extension, this idea between distinction between public housing and rental housing and all the different three-tiered systems that was never rebutted. We said on rental homes, the problem is that people end up spending far more money because they can never individually amass enough money to buy a home. That's inequitable. We also think it's bad for them. We also said that, like, for those people who can't get private ownership under the current scheme, like, we think that it massively frees up the rental market, as I've already mentioned. Finally, we talked about public housing and why relying on all poor people or people on low incomes or low to middle incomes being in public housing is enormously detrimental to society. It packs everyone into overcrowded, miserable areas, ladies and gentlemen, where they have no incentive to improve their life, no incentive to stay away from crime, and no incentive to contribute to society, ladies and gentlemen. We think the opposite of that is good, and that's why we propose.
In opposition of Queensland A, votes by Lauren Humphrey, take the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, contrary to what you've heard from closing proposition, the majority of people in the lower socioeconomic classes are not currently living in housing assistance properties. They are renters. What we told you at closing is they will now have to pay more for their rental property. That is the majority of people in this debate that both sides decided they wanted to have. Not getting a house, which is now more expensive, and I'll talk about that later, and now having to pay more for rental properties. We say that is a massive problem which they chose not to engage with. So let's start with how do we provide housing for poor people. Then I want to talk about how this sets up homeowners to fail. Hint, subprime happened because we lent to subprime borrowers. And finally, is there a right to house ownership? So starting with, how do we provide housing for poor people? And essentially the logic we got out of closing was, this is really good for renters because there'll be less renters in the market. The problem with that analysis, which Evan explained and then they chose to ignore, was that the same properties that can be owned by people who own that housing can also be rented out. If you make more of those properties home ownership properties, those are properties that aren't in the rental market anymore. There's less rental accommodation. That makes prices higher. The other thing we told you on this issue was, no thank you, if every Tom, Dick and Harry is walking around with your subsidy, then everyone can afford to pay more for their house in the first place. No thank you, it's their income plus the other 50% the government's going to chip in. And their response to this was just like, oh well that's fine because price is higher, but subsidy take you there.
In the medium term, that would only be true if all housing in society were fixed. Why don't you think people occasionally build homes?
First of all, not true, because the housing market is finite, it's called amount of land. Second of all, everyone still gets your subsidy. So overall, you're still competing with a group of people who all have the same amount of money. It's just been increased by 50%. No thank you, the logic holds. This will not help future generations. The 40% increase in housing prices will still occur. They've helped no one. But in the process, the rental market's smaller and renters get screwed over. We think that's really, really bad. No thank you. So in a world where the majority of poor people will never be helped by their model, they will still have to rent. We don't think it's a good idea to force up a rental, no thank you, the rental price. Now the second issue in this debate, how does this set up homeowners to fail? Now, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac over here thought all they needed to say was, no, there was like risky packaging going on, and that was the real problem with subprime. The start of subprime was when we lent to people who should never have gotten loans because they were subprime borrowers in the first place. And what Evan told you in this analysis, again, they just chose to ignore, was why saving a deposit, and a whole deposit, not just a pseudo half deposit, is really important to do. It's because you have to prove and experience saving. Prove that you can pay back that debt. Make sure that we're lending to people who can afford to pay that mortgage. Not just lending to any Tom, Dick and Harry who wants a loan. And they told you, no, our system's really different to the status quo because banks won't engage in dodgy investments at the end of the line. We say it changes nothing about what Freddie Mac and Freddie Mae actually did at the beginning, which was to give a whole bunch of loans to a group of people, no thank you, who could only afford the loan if they were given subsidies the whole way through, no thank you, who hadn't saved a deposit in the first place, so we didn't know whether they could save long term, and then when they started defaulting, we had nothing we could do about it, no thank you. There is value in people saving to get their property in the first place, because we lend to the people who can pay it back, not subprime borrowers who should never ever be given a loan in the first place. Not all people, by virtue of being poor, deserve a loan. Some of them will never be able to pay it back. And the logic we got from the opening half was, that's fine, governments run programs that are losses. Continue by closing. If the answer to their model is, oh, well, that's cool, we'll just let lots of people default, that is really stupid. How is that good for poor people when they lose their houses because they couldn't pay back the loan? No, thank you. Not only is the government screwed because they just lost a lot of money, the people are forced to move and leave the houses that they've defaulted on. No, thank you. Finally, this issue of, is there a right to home ownership? Now again, a lot of material brought out by us and they just decided, hey, not going to respond to that. So what we heard from closing was, this is so much better than rental. And I'll take you in a moment. The problem that Evan pointed out, and again not responded to, is if you have the loan for your whole life because you couldn't afford to take out in the first place and the government gave it to you and now it's going to extend your whole lifetime, that's not better than rental. It's like rental by another name. It's a perennial rental that may or may not give you a house at the end, and I'll tackle that in a moment. I'll take you there.
Do you think there will be more foreclosures when there is a high and variable bank interest rate or a low government stable interest rate?
Yeah, no, it's rubbish. The interest rate is not the reason they're defaulting. It's because we're giving loans to people who've never learned how to save properly, who never afford to take out money in the first place. I don't care if the interest rate is 1%, they're still not going to be able to keep paying their loan unless they prove at the beginning that this is what they can do. So, the second thing they told us here was, well, that doesn't matter because we have an asset at the end of the day. So there is a right to home ownership, no thank you, because people get assets at the end of the day. We say, if you've been putting money into buying that asset, if we don't give you that asset, you have the amount of money you would have spent on that asset in your pockets. No thank you. It's not like you've got an extra amount of money that just magically apparated out of nowhere. You either have the house or you have the amount of money you spent paying off the loan to the house. This isn't an extra asset that just appears. The other thing they told us here, the justification for a right to home ownership is equity problems. That's what we heard from closing. There are equity problems here. We say, sure, we can't force banks to give loans to people who don't deserve them. We're not saying you should. What you can do is force them to conduct a reasonable background check. Like if the government wants to mandate that banks can't, for instance, just decide on the basis of a postcode, and maybe they should do an individual background check, that's fine with us. If the government wants to mandate that you can't look into what your parents did and whether they, default on the loan, that's fine with us. Nothing about that forces a bank to lend to people that they otherwise wouldn't. It just lent to the wrong people. We won't do that again. We won't turn the government into Freddie and Fannie Mark II. We stand in opposition.
Before everyone leaves, straight away the student centre where the break night was held in the multifunctional hall at the ESL final right now. If the adjudications for the main semi-finals have finished by the end, we will have the result at the end of that. And a final reminder to everyone, bring your accreditation to the City Hall. You will not get into the final without your accreditation. Please bring it. Thanks.